All right, today I'm finally going to answer the age-old question. What's the difference between an oboe and a bassoon? Now, of course, at first glance, these two instruments look nothing alike. I mean, there's very little physical similarity between the two instruments. And yet, these are our two double reed instruments. So, first off, let's talk about the double reed. A double reed is two pieces of cane tied together that vibrate to form the sound of the instrument. I've got both an oboe and a bassoon reed here, my trusty glass of water, my reed soaking cup. This is an oboe reed. It is tied onto this little tube here called a staple, and the staple goes into the instrument. I can show you that here. Just pops right in and the reed sits in the instrument. Oboe reed will sound something a little bit like something like that. That's an oboe reed. A bassoon reed, on the other hand, is not tied to the staple. It's got its own tube. And with this, the bassoon reed goes on to the instrument. So it is put onto the bocal, which is this tube here. So the bassoon reed goes onto the instrument, the oboe reed goes into the instrument. However, the staple on the oboe reed is essentially a tiny little bocal. Because it is so short, the only effective way to attach the reed to the staple or the tiny little bocal is to tie it on. And when this reed is dead, it just gets cut off and the staple can get reused. So the manner of putting the reed on the instrument, while there are some differences, is more or less the same. It just gets tied on to the bocal staple on an oboe, and it slips onto the bocal on a bassoon. One of the next things you'll notice is the difference in shape. The oboe is a straight tube. Starts here, goes here, completely straight. The bassoon, on the other hand, has a lot of bends and turns in it. So you've got your first kind of 90-degree bend here, and then down here at the boot joint, there is what's called a U-bend or a U-tube. This is the original U-tube right here. It is a 180-degree bend so that the air column goes down and back up. And it does this because the bassoon would be too long to be in one straight tube. Effectively, the bassoon has about 9 feet of air column. It's actually less than that because the reed functions as the last 6 or so inches of that air column. You'll also notice that the two instruments are made of different material. Oboes tend to be made out of grenadilla wood, same kind of wood as a clarinet, while bassoons are made out of maple. However, the material that an instrument is made of doesn't have that much of an effect on the overall sound quality. Yes, there are going to be some slight variations, but 99.5% of the sound is not going to change between material to material. Bassoons are not made out of grenadilla wood because, one, grenadilla is a much heavier and denser wood. It would increase the weight of the bassoon by about 2 times. And finding pieces of grenadilla wood big enough to make a bassoon is almost impossible. It's a slow-growing tree that's not very big. However, the bassoon is typically made out of maple wood. This is a common tree. It grows in temperate environments, and it's very easy to get large enough pieces of maple wood. In fact, this is the same wood that baseball bats are made out of and good high-end cabinetry. It's a common wood, it's easy to get, and you can get it in very large pieces. The next thing we'll talk about is the range of the instrument. And we'll start first with the oboe. Now we're going to talk about the fundamental scale of an instrument. The scale of an instrument is the basic scale it plays when you start with 7 fingers down. In this case, the oboe is in the key of C. 7 fingers down right here gives you a C. In fact, let me just go ahead and try and play a few notes on the oboe. It's been like 20 years since I really practiced oboe, so forgive me if I still sound a little bit like a duck. That's the fundamental scale of the oboe. Notice it is not a major scale. We'll get to that here in a minute. Now, below the oboe's range, we can go 2 additional semitones. That's a B flat, a whole step below the fundamental scale. And that's it. You only can go down 2 notes. Most larger oboes, oboes d'amore, English horns, and most bass oboes will only go to the B natural. Heckelphones, on the other hand, will go to a semitone further and go down to A. There is some variability. You will find English horns with low B flats. You'll find heckelphones with low Bs. It's not universal, but it's a good standard. All oboes should have a low B flat. Oboes d'amore, English horns, bass oboes only go to B. And heckelphones usually go to low A. The bassoon, on the other hand, has a fundamental scale of F. That means if I play a 7-finger note, that note is F. And I'll play that fundamental scale of the bassoon. And again, you'll notice it's not a major scale, it's a Lydian scale. Both the oboe and the bassoon have what we call a hard scale. That means that the 4th note is sharp. Or in this case, natural, because on bassoon it's a B natural. On the oboe, that note would be F sharp. A soft scale would be when the 4th note of the scale is flat. In this case, B flat. That's the soft scale. These are terms going back to the Baroque and Renaissance eras. Now, unlike the oboe, the bassoon has a much larger downward extension. The bassoon goes down a 5th below the fundamental scale. So the lowest note of the fundamental scale of a bassoon is F. But we can go down a lot further. All the way down to B flat. This is where some people do get confused because the lowest note of the bassoon and the lowest note of the oboe are both B flat. However, the 2 instruments are fundamentally pitched only an octave and a half apart. Not 2 octaves, but an octave and a half. The downward extension of a 5th below the bassoon's fundamental scale is a key aspect of what makes it a bassoon. Because of that folded over shape, we are now able to easily access those extended notes. Most other woodwinds do not have a scale extended that far. Most woodwinds only have a scale like the oboe, extended about 2 semitones. For instance, the flute, if we take C as its lowest note, sometimes has no extension and sometimes has a semitone extension to B natural. The clarinet, whose fundamental scale is F in the lower register and C in the upper register, has a fundamental extension of a semitone down to low E. Saxophones likewise have an extension down to B flat, just like the oboe, although some baritone saxophones have an extension to A. The bassoon stands out in that it always has an extension of a fifth, with one little exception. There are some older contrabassoons that only go down to C, and they therefore only have an extension of a fourth. And again, you'll also run into bassoons and contrabassoons with low A's, which means they have an extension of a sixth, but those are outliers. Likewise, you'll also find some oboes, very rarely, with an extension to low A. Herein is one of the biggest differences between an oboe and a bassoon. Bassoons always have a downward extension of a fifth. Oboes always have an extension of a second, major or minor. The other big fundamental difference is the shape of the tone holes. And in order to show you that, I've got here a Baroque bassoon. I also have right here one piece Baroque works. This Baroque bassoon also happens to be Baroquan. I was gifted this, and it has no keys, but it is a perfect teaching tool. So what I've got here is just a standard, ordinary Q-tip. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to put this Baroque bassoon sideways, so you can see it here, and this Q-tip is going to go into the first finger tone hole. And I want you to take a look at that. That first finger tone hole is angled almost 45 degrees. If I put this in the second finger tone hole, look at that. It's got an angle that way, and it's got an angle that way. Third finger tone hole, likewise, at an angle. In fact, if I go down the instrument all the way, every tone hole is angled until I get onto the bass joint, also called the long joint. Now, those angled tone holes are there so that the span between the fingers can be shorter. Because what ends up happening is, for the first finger, the tone hole actually enters the bore around here. The second finger enters the bore around here, and the third finger enters all the way down here. So therefore, you would have to have a stretch almost like that. And that is not comfortable. In fact, that hurts. I'm going to stop doing that. So what they did is they angled the tone holes. By angling the tone holes, you make the instrument longer for that specific note. However, it has another side effect, and this is a side effect most people would never think about. It softens the instrument, and this is something that I discovered while I was doing acoustic experiments with the Great Bassoon. Originally, when I was designing the Great Bassoon, I had the tone holes all go in completely perpendicular, just like they are on an oboe. Oboe tone holes all go in perpendicular to the bore. There's no angling needed because all the tone holes are covered by keys. The bassoon, however, doesn't work that way. Even on the modern bassoon, we have 5 tone holes that are still completely open. The Baroque bassoon still has a 6th tone hole down here that is operated by the right ring finger. So by angling the tone holes, the sound becomes mellower, it becomes softer. And this is the fundamental characteristic difference between an oboe and a bassoon timbrally. It means that the bassoon's always going to have a little bit mellower sound than the oboe will. And it is thanks in part to the angled tone holes that are a fundamental aspect of bassoon design. You'll see this on pretty much all sizes of bassoon, although some contrabassoons will go in a little bit straighter of an angle because contrabassoons, because you don't have any open holes, all just pretty much go straight into the bore. The contraforte, Guntram Wolf's revolutionary contrabassoon design, takes this even more extreme, and nothing is angled on a contraforte, which does lead to the contraforte having a brighter sound than a standard contrabassoon. It's not just that it's a bigger bore, it's the tone holes aren't angled. In the 1800s, when they tried to make a Böhm system bassoon with straight in tone holes, one of the things they discovered was that the pleasing sound of the bassoon started to go away. Unfortunately, I've never been able to hear a Böhm system bassoon, but from everything I've read about it, it wasn't the sound that people were used to. It just didn't sound like a bassoon anymore. And maybe if you do that, it becomes more of a bass or contrabass oboe. In fact, when I first built the first prototype great bassoon, it had a much more oboe-like sound. It almost sounded like, well, what you would expect a contrabass oboe to sound like, because all the tone holes were in at angles. Over various iterations, we angled the tone holes more and more and more, and it became much more of a bassoon-like sound. So in doing this, I really did discover that the biggest difference between a bassoon and an oboe, it's not the scale, it's not the reed, it's not the extension, it is the fact that bassoons have angled tone holes, and therefore the sound gets mellowed a lot. If you were to make a large oboe with angled tone holes, it would sound pretty much like a bassoon. Conversely, if you made a small bassoon with straight tone holes, it's going to sound pretty much like an oboe. Yes, there are differences in reed design, there are differences in playing characteristics, but the two instruments have a lot more in common than we tend to think. So much so that there's a lot of people who say, it's two members of the same family. They're not really distinct voices. You can have just a continuum oboe down to bassoon, be done with it. You now have a complete family of soprano through bass. So let me know, what do you think? Do you know any other distinct differences between an oboe and a bassoon? Of course, the old answer is, of course, the bassoon burns longer. Don't go burning bassoons. Definitely don't go burning oboes either, because the wood when burned gives off toxic fumes. Don't do that. But anyway, thanks everybody for watching. Again, do you know any other distinct features between oboes and bassoons? Let me know down in the comments. And as always, thanks for watching.